Thank you, Natasha, for the introduction and for a fantastic presentation. So I'd like to present a web of propositions for you today, which is ongoing research for new artwork, namely by tracing historical maritime routes of disease transmission, how these narratives have been represented throughout time and continues to impact how the modern mind reads illness, and ultimately feeds into collective imaginations, stories, and personal fictions that may arise. I like to call images that I encounter as starting points for my films. Some of these images I'm sure you have seen before, yet fail in some capacity as they feel quite distant from me. I'd like to focus here on as of yet unwritten stories around these images. The connections or nodes that link the fragments that I will present is how I'd like to tease out certain political entanglements embedded within the Indian Ocean world. I've lately been thinking a lot about catastrophe. More often than not, it feels like an apocalypse where the world does not quite end but regenerates in preparation for the next disaster. My film, The Anima, began with conversations with Smithsonian wildlife veterinarians back in 2017. The departure point for this work had been field research in Myanmar back in 2018, where Smithsonian wildlife veterinarians were hunting for new strains of coronaviruses to predict their pandemic potential. The sacred caves depicted in the film work are both high-risk interfaces as well as sites of spiritual encounter between humans and animals, science and religion, nature and politics, interfaces where ecosystems cross and feed into global conflict. This work behind the scenes had been underway for years and sheds light on the inevitable, not of why, but an unknown when, offering ominous prelude to the current global health crisis. In order to stretch time away from the present, I weaved in animation based on tactile memories of being in these caves and dreams of an apocalyptic future. This future I envisioned as a field of poppies where information flows deep within our own politicized bodies and channeling into virtual networks. The work attempts to unveil how various gendered, racialized, economic, and especially metabolic systems in the global health system drive fear of contamination from the non-human or sometimes less than human worlds. We still carry this historically rooted fear that rendered racialized and gendered bodies as a threat, feminine and wild. This desire to tame, contain, and control incubates and further propagates this fear in the present. It is, in a way, my own origin story.
To describe where I go in words, to describe what it feels like. It's dark, it's powerful, it's intense. There are smells that are wafting through your nose, that burn the nostrils, that burn the cells that line the airways. It hurts. And every time you smell the intense levels of ammonia coming from the guano, from these bats, it's just a constant reminder that you're putting yourself at risk. The fear of knowing that it just takes one, knowing that it's happened several times before, many times before, and knowing with certainty there's a strong likelihood, paired up with the rising population of exponential growth, this is going to happen again. So I can do everything I can within my power to prevent that from happening.
Oh, okay. Thank you. The anima feeds into ongoing questions about crossing physical and psychological thresholds, but the collective responsibility we face in order to deal with the inevitability of future pandemics, the psychological intricacies of how we process epidemic crisis, and the realities of xenophobia and racism that they engender. In a recent conversation with Laurent de Vasquez, he posed several questions in relation to how the modern mind reads diseases. Perhaps going beyond defining terminology such as disease versus illness, he introduced a temporal concept, the moment in which a disease, a term which has historically been designated for that which is not quite human, becomes an illness, which is usually reserved for the privileged. Blame and responsibility for contagion within the popular imagination has lied with what is perceived as foreign. As Susan Sontag writes, psychological theories of illness are a powerful means of placing the blame on the ill. Patients who are instructed that they have unwittingly caused their disease are also being made to feel that they have deserved it. In my investigations into zoonosis, stigmatization of the carrier, the vector, the individual body overshadows collective responsibility, such as exploitative human intervention on the environment and the neglect and treatment of health beyond the human. All these things perpetuate spread amongst those furthest away from writing governmental policy. I am most interested in tuning back into individual experience as sources of rich narratives to break down the institutional constructs that silence them. I've been living in the Netherlands for the past few months, and I have been encountering paintings such as this. At first glance, I see heroic, mythic depictions of the seas through conquest and invasion, driven by the turbulence of the currents and winds. I'm not entirely sure whether their purpose was to tame or glorify the wildness, or rather unpredictability of these waterways. My mind wanders as I imagine the stories leading up to and following this one stagnant moment in time, conceived by artists who are on the so-called right side of history. If this were a film still, and I can jump some frames, what sort of stories could I then excavate that expose violence and chaos in motion? The monsoon winds that guided vessels such as these carried not only humans and their material commodities, but other living beings such as plants and animals as vectors and viruses. These currents also influence the evolution of how the body is conceived in relation to histories of mercantile commerce, epidemics, migration, and medical histories. These are some of the images that I've encountered along the way and hope to further stretch. This engraving, for example, depicts an idealized version of contact. The environment is the placid receiver of human labor, and animals peacefully coexist. Imbalance, exploitation, and mass extinction are conveniently left out in this sanitized version of the past. This portrait had once survived the treacherous journey to the Netherlands. Over the course of the 17th century, the desire for exotic animals from the Indian Ocean created a commercial demand among citizens and royals as yet another commodity for trade. The keepers of the inn Blauw Jan in Amsterdam ran an animal business that became a popular tourist destination. Scientists used the remains of the deceased animals for research. Painters portrayed them. In a sense, the ships that carried these animals also spread knowledge about them to new shores. Yet what was left behind resulted in a mass extinction for which only their representation in captivity remains. The dodo in Mauritius had at one point in time coexisted with animals introduced by Europeans as laborers of capital interest. Such encounters prompted a twisted way of relating to the non-human in the form of parody. These animals were given European personalities and characteristics, perhaps as an attempt to familiarize that which is perceived as foreign or wild. The dodo had been described as rich and fat mares, a symbol of gluttony. Yet once the curiosity and fear subsided, these animals were once again regarded as food and objects of consumption. The carcass of the mosquito had undergone scientific scrutiny to understand how this once living being had been a vector for malaria. Perhaps one of their ancestors in another life had also been implicated in outbreak, feeding on the blood of human laborers during a time when the monsoons stood still. I wonder if this mosquito could have witnessed these moments of crisis where the burden and blame of infectious disease did not fall on those destroying the land to make room for expanding industries, but on those very bodies who were cultivating it. Perhaps if the mosquito had indeed lived longer, one of their progeny could have witnessed more recent public health crises that reaffirmed political borders, division, and institutionalized forms of containment. This is an image of the Lazaret de la Grande Chaloupe on La Réunion, created in 1860. It served as a quarantine ward for workers on the island as indentured labor to control the spread of disease. I wonder if such nautical points of connection and isolation could be one scene in my film, for which the cacophony of voices once confined within the institution walls could be resurrected, where their bodies are released from production and the roles as carriers is dissolved. I imagine these stories resonating within a certain stillness or silence. I jump to a quote here from Calcutta Chromosome, which rewrites the history of Sir Ronald Ross's so-called discovery of the malaria parasite in the 19th century. It challenges the legitimacy of Western science and foregrounds silence and invisibility as vehicles for knowledge production using the genre of science fiction. But here in our city, where all law, natural and human, is held in capricious suspension, that which is hidden has no need of words to give it life. Like any creature that lives in a perverse element, it mutates to discover sustenance precisely where it appears to be most starkly withheld, in this case, in silence. In this last fragment, I question what forms of knowledge exchange and intermeshing of medical techniques occurred in an earlier moment in time. Arabian doctors had been using bezoar stones since the 8th century. They were introduced to medieval Europe centuries later as an antidote to poison. Amulets such as these were conceived by animals and then extracted from them, formed by a hard crust built up around a foreign body in the stomach of animals such as cows and goats. In a Hakim's tale, Shirin Hamza reroutes us to a different sort of understanding of these exchanges within the history of science. She presents the work of 14th century physician Shiab al-Din Nagari, who added an autobiographical chapter to the end of a medical text describing his experiences learning and practicing medicine. Hamza writes, terms like braided knowledge have been suggested to understand the synthesis of multiple strands of knowing and the heterogeneity within each strand. Nagari's text and texts and other texts of medicine from the medieval period make a strong case for historians to explore these themes in pre-colonial knowledge production as well. This may further destabilize the widespread idea of static, homogeneous medical system, which were inevitably ruptured rather than transformed by medical modernity. I end with a recent work that speaks to alternative and even interdimensional forms of healing that shift away from the clinical gaze. It speculates how approaches and relationships that privilege personal connection and intimacy can inform healing and transformation. The excerpt I am about to show you is a fictional rendering of British painter Mary Barnes's 1973 memoir. Barnes, suffering from schizophrenia, embarks on a journey to explore inner world deep within her own psyche in order to seek alternative spiritual experiences and create her own personal mythology. The work is a historical reference of lived experience in which ontological distinctions between self and other, interior and exterior, become blurred. I've approached these historical testimonies of lived experience and their expressions as acts of consciousness itself, lived in the very moment. Although nearly impossible to analyze from the outside, I use digital worlds as a space to gain closer proximity to lived experience. Thank you.